UFC Vegas 82 betting and DraftKings show. We have 14 fights this weekend, 2 p.m. Eastern start time, $100,000 to first place on DraftKings. I'm Jon Kelly. Let's hear the picks. And we're going to get things started in the flyweight division as Rafael Estevam comes in as a small favorite at -130. The comeback on Charles Johnson is +110. And I like the Estevam side. He's a former Dana White's Contender Series fighter, 11-0 prospect making his UFC debut. He did have a couple fights that ended up getting scrapped last minute, so that's why it's taken so long to make his UFC debut here. But I do think it's a favorable matchup for him. He's primarily a grappler, seems to have pretty solid wrestling, holds a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that's typically how he wins most of his fights because his striking is a little bit sloppy. He does carry some power, but it's clear that he wants to get the fight to the ground, and I think he's going to be able to do that against a guy like Charles Johnson, who's never been able to defend takedowns. He defends takedowns at 54% in the UFC, and yes, he faced some of the better grapplers in the division, but basically anybody that tries to take him down is going to be able to do so. What he's very good at is popping right back up, working back to his feet, and he's historically very difficult to submit as well. But even though he's hard to take out and hard to hold down, it doesn't mean he's good at winning rounds. And that's where I struggle with a guy like Charles Johnson, who, even though I do expect him to be the cleaner striker here, he's just not the type of guy that separates in terms of his round winning ability. Even times where he did have the striking advantage, he just doesn't put his foot on the gas pedal enough to separate in those close competitive rounds. And that's why we see a lot of these decisions maybe not go his way in some of these close fights. So I'm going to side with the grappler. I do expect Estevam to land multiple takedowns here. For that reason, I do have interest on DraftKings in the mid-range. I think he can land 3, 4, even 5 takedowns in this spot and score pretty well. So we're going with the Estevam. I think he gets it done, and it likely comes by decision. And next up, we have Nicholas Moda, a -135 favorite. The comeback on Trey Ogden is +114. And this is one that's an interesting matchup to me because on one hand, we have Nicholas Moda, who's basically a one-dimensional power boxer. You know, his boxing is pretty decent, but he is hittable, and he just doesn't have any durability. This dude has been knocked out 4 times in his career, one of them being Jim Miller, one of them coming in the first round in his last fight. So it's just not a guy that you like to trust when his game plan is to stand and bang with you, and he just doesn't have the chin to be able to withstand what's coming back his way. Now, fortunately for him, in this matchup, Trey Ogden has 0 wins by knockout in his career. He just doesn't seem to be much of a threat on the feet. He's more of a leg kicker, very vanilla in terms of his striking. In fact, most of his wins have actually come by submission, despite him not really even looking to get the fight to the ground in a lot of these fights. So I just don't think he has the biggest way to take advantage of Moda being that durability. I don't think he has that skill set. And then on the flip side, the easiest way to get Trey Ogden out of there is to grapple him. He has 3 losses coming by submission. Moda, 0 career submission victory. So it's one of those things where I think the finish is being overstated in the market. You can actually get plus money on the over 2.5 currently. That will be a play for me at some point this week. I do like the overs. I think they're mispriced here. The official pick is going to be Moda by decision, just because I think it's a close competitive fight, and I think his power might be the difference maker in what should be a close one. Next fight up, we have Airi Perez, a -185 favorite. The comeback on Lucy Pudilova is +154. And I'm going to side with the favorite here in Perez. We saw just how good she can be in this division in terms of her grappling and her pace, because those two things alone, even though she's not the world's greatest grappler, but combining her ability to land takedowns along with that pace is going to go a long way in this division. And I know it came against Ashley Evans-Smith, who's basically decrepit at this stage in her career, can't defend takedowns whatsoever, but I think Perez has shown she is good enough to land takedowns against a lot of opponents in this division, and I think she'll be able to do that against Lucy Pudilova, who struggled to defend takedowns, particularly her first run in the UFC prior to being let go. Now she's come back. She's had a little bit of grappling success against people that weren't really able to defend takedowns, but you've also seen her get out-grappled by people that are somewhat competent on the mat, and I think that fits the bill here against Airi Perez, who I just expect to be the better grappler. I don't think either of these women are very good strikers. I think Perez probably has a little bit more pop in her punches, but I do think it's going to be multiple takedowns. That's going to be the game plan. We see her rinse and repeat takedowns, get the better of the grappling exchanges, and get her hand raised. We're going Eileen Perez by decision. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Lucas Alexander, one of the bigger favorites on the card at -455. The comeback on Jekka Seregi is +350. And we'll start on the Alexander side. He's an 8-3 prospect. He made his UFC debut on short notice, previously fought Joe Anderson Burrito, and was submitted inside the first round, but he bounced back against Steven Peterson and won a decision in his last time out. Now, he's typically more of a kill or be killed style of fighter, and there's a couple of those on this card that we'll get to later. But in terms of Alexander, he's primarily a striker, not super clean and technical, but he does have clear power on the feet. The one leak in his game, and it's a big one, is that the dude cannot grapple basically whatsoever. Any decent grapplers are going to be able to take him down and potentially submit him. All 3 losses in his career have come by way of submission. Now, fortunately for him, Seregi is not much of a grappler. He's a 13-3 fighter coming off the road to UFC, and he fought Anshul Jubilee in his UFC debut. And he just doesn't seem to be UFC level, to be completely honest with you. He does have power on the feet. He's going to throw with bad intentions, but he gets very sloppy as well. And I think either one of these guys can clip each other. I'm just going to side with the guy in Lucas Alexander, who's bigger, who's going to be throwing more volume, who I think has more power as well. And Seregi just doesn't have the grappling chops to take advantage of Alexander's biggest weakness. So we're going Alexander by TKO. That's the official pick. And next fight up in the heavyweight division, we have Mick Parkin, a -380 favorite. The comeback on Kai Machado is +300. And this is a very low-level heavyweight fight. On one hand, we have Mick Parkin, who previously fought on Contender Series, made his UFC debut against Jamal Pogues, and came through in a big way as an underdog in front of his home crowd at UFC London. It was a pretty decent showing for him. He did win that 3rd round, which I was impressed with because it was the first time he had gone to decision in his career. So the cardio checked out for the most part, and that was a concern coming into that fight for me. And I think that's going to be his biggest advantage against a guy like Kai Machado, who also came off the Contender Series. He fought on this past season in week 1 and just didn't really look all that good, to be honest with you. Like, the dude is the former BFL heavyweight champ, very low level regional people that he fought in the Canadian regional scene. And then the one time he was tested against somebody that looked to be somewhat decent was Kevin Szaflarski on that Contender Series fight. And Szaflarski literally just stared at him, did nothing the entire 15 minutes. And Machado honestly didn't even look that good. He seemed to be tired after the first few minutes, huffing and puffing. I think any decent showing would have got Szaflarski out of there. Machado failed to do that. He seems to be a round one or bust type of fighter, like a budget version of a guy like Jordan Wright, the Beverly Hills Ninja, but I don't even think he has that type of ceiling. So I think Machado's a guy that's basically going to be one of those fighters that has to meme you early, and if he's unable to do that, he's probably going to get himself finished. So I lean with Parkin here. I don't think Parkin's very good, but I think he's more proven than Machado, and I think the gas tank is the biggest advantage here. As the fight gets extended, I'd expect Parkin to be landing more and doing enough to get his hand raised here. We're going Parkin by TKO. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Christian Leroy Duncan, a -305 favorite. The comeback on Dennis Ty-Lulan is +255. And we'll start on the Leroy Duncan side. He's an 8-1 prospect fighting out of England. He's coming off his first career loss against Armen Petrosyan, where he was just outgunned, honestly, on the feet. Petrosyan's a very technical striker and has good cardio. Leroy Duncan is a guy who does have impressive striking. He's more of a flashy striker. You know, he kind of conserves his energy and then uses it in short, explosive burst. And he's very quick when he does that. When he does let his hands go, which isn't super often, if he connects on you, he has the power to get you out of there. Most of his wins have come by knockout, and that speaks to his fighting style. Now, I still have concerns about the volume, the output, and just the well-roundedness of his game. He doesn't really seem to have much of a grappling game, but I just don't think this is a matchup to expose those holes. I think the previous one against Petrosyan was a nice spot, but this one not so much, because Dennis Ty-Lulan is basically just an early KO or bust type of fighter. He's 10-8 professionally, been finished a bunch of times in his career, never been able to defensively grapple, been submitted multiple times, but he's also been knocked out as well. And So unless Ty-Lulan is able to catch Leroy Duncan early, I just don't really see how he wins this fight. And I just don't even really see that happening because Duncan's going to be a lot faster. He's younger, more durable as well. And I think just all of those advantages combined make him the rightful favorite here. I think he probably does catch Ty-Lulan at some point and get him out of there. We're going Christian Leroy Duncan by TKO. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Jose Johnson, a -185 favorite. The comeback on Chad and Hellinger is +154. And I like the Johnson side in this matchup. You guys know, if you've been following me for a while, I've never been an Hellinger guy. The one thing that I'll say about him is he does have heart, which I totally respect, and that makes you want to root for him. But in terms of the skill set, I just don't think he's really UFC level, to be honest with you. I think he's more of like a regional grinder, a solid regional grinder, not necessarily a guy that's going to come in here and win multiple UFC fights. And I think at this stage in his career, you know, he turns 37 in a few weeks at featherweight. That's not a great look. He's definitely getting older, coming off a sizable layoff due to a shoulder injury. There's another red flag. And then I think the size difference here is pretty big because Johnson's going to be like 6 or 7 inches taller, going to have a huge length advantage in this fight. And I think Johnson's going to be the better striker as well. And Hellinger, his striking isn't bad, but I think he's going to struggle to close that distance. Johnson could mix in the leg kicks. He's got quick hands as well. And I think another edge for Johnson in this fight is he's a sneaky good submission grappler. You see it in a lot of his fights. He only has a couple submission victories, but he's going for it and looking for it in multiple fights. And it typically gets him out of position. And that's why that's been a knock on him against previous matchups where he's facing guys like Jack Cartwright and some of these other guys that are just going to be better grapplers and beating him to some of these exchanges. Damon Blackshear in his last fight, we cashed that Blackshear by submission ticket that last time out. So I feel like I have a good read on the type of fighters that Johnson is going to work well against, and also the type of fighters that he's going to struggle against. And I don't think Hellinger is a guy that he's going to struggle against because I think the striking is going to be at worst competitive. And then I think the grappling is Jose Johnson here. Even though he's not positionally sound, I think he can catch a guy like Hellinger, who's been submitted multiple times in his career. Johnson, like I mentioned, he knows what he's doing on the mat. He's not going to consolidate position, but he is going to hunt for subs. So if we get a big number like I expect on some of these domestic books, once they open up that price, I'm definitely going to be looking to bet Johnson by submission, and he's a solid DraftKings target as well. Next fight up, we have Jonathan Pierce, a small favorite at -130. The comeback on Joe Anderson Burrito is +110. And this is one that I think you just definitely want to get exposure to both sides on DraftKings. And I think because it's regardless of who wins, I think there's a very high chance that they score well. Because on one hand, you have JSP, Jonathan Pierce, who historically is a great DraftKings scorer, because what does he do? He looks to get inside, stick to you like glue, mat return, rack up multiple takedowns, dominate you on the mat. That's his style. But where he struggles is anytime this dude's at space, he seems to be getting hurt. Like, his durability is not good. I think a guy as explosive as Joe Anderson Burrito, who has that first round, big energy in the first round, a lot of first round finishes because he has that type of power, I think a guy like Burrito could potentially catch JSP and knock him out. So I think this is either JSP via grappling dominant decision, which scores well, or it's going to be Burrito by early TKO, which scores well as well. So I'm going to side with Burrito because he's the underdog, and I really trust the power of him, and I don't fully trust the chin of JSP, but like I said, it's not one that I'm super convicted on. I'm going to hedge it out on DraftKings, but the official pick is going to be Burrito by TKO. Which brings us to our featured bout on the prelims, as we have Miktabek Oralbai making his UFC debut on short notice, actually only a couple days notice here, to take on Uros Medic. Miktabek is a small favorite at -125, currently Medic on the comeback at +105, and We'll start on the Oralbai side. He seems to be a pretty solid, well-rounded prospect. Previously fought over in LFA for a few years and looked pretty good doing so. He's an 11-1 prospect, 10 of those wins coming inside the distance. His striking seems to be decent. He definitely carries some power, and then his grappling seems to be pretty solid as well. He can land multiple takedowns. He has in a couple of his fights on the regional scene. And then on the flip side, Uros Medic, aside from just being a very dangerous striker early, he does have the benefit of coming in on a full camp. And this is a guy that I think we have seen improvements from fight to fight. So I feel like this might be too much too soon for Uralbai. I'd like to see him more on a full camp. You know, he just fought 3 weeks ago in LFA, won by second round knockout. So it's very short notice, probably wasn't expecting to fight here. And it's probably the toughest test that he's had to date against a guy like Uros Medic, who's a very powerful striker, going to be blasting those leg kicks. And I think the grappling is at least getting better. It's harder to take him down than it was early on in the UFC. He seems to be training quite a bit on his grappling in the gym and stuff like that. So this is a guy that I kind of want to bet on him making improvements, and the fact that this is a lot of respect to give a UFC newcomer on just a couple days notice. So I'm going to side with Medic here. I think it comes inside the distance. Medic has never seen the judges' scorecards. I think this one ends early. We're going Medic by TKO. That's the official pick. And kicking off the main card, we have Amanda Ribas, a -250 favorite. The comeback on Luana Pinheiro is +205. And we'll start on the Ribas side. She's dropping back down to 115 here, coming off the knockout loss to Macy Barber. And that's been really her downfall, is that durability. She's now been knocked out 3 times in her career, and anytime she's at space, you just don't really feel comfortable if you're backing her and you have money on her, because she's unable to take the damage in a lot of these fights. It's really concerning, but the skill set is certainly there. She's got a solid jab. She can mix in the leg kicks as well. She keeps a high pace on the feet, and she averages over 2 takedowns per 15 minutes. She's got good control once she gets you down, and a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, certainly capable of finding that submission as well. So all of those things are great, but it's the durability, the reason that I'm not like windmill slam dunking her as a parlay piece this weekend against Luana Pinheiro, who I've never thought is really all that good in terms of her round winning ability. You know, coming into her Contender Series fight a couple seasons ago, she had basically all first round knockouts, first round finishes on the regional scene, and got the first round finish on Contender Series. But as we've seen at the UFC level, when that early finish doesn't materialize, she has some serious gas tank issues, and she fades after that first round. But what she has is that explosive power and that early finishing ability. So I think she is live here if she's able to test the chin of Amanda Ribas, who's now cutting that extra 10 pounds again, getting down to 115. So the knockout is a possibility, but it's also like, at the end of the day, I'm not really in the business of betting on WMMA knockouts at 115 pounds really all that often. So in terms of DraftKings, I think Pinheiro is tempting because she's very cheap, and for that reason I'll have some exposure. But I do think the better fighter, the better round winner, the one who gets it done on Saturday is going to be Amanda Ribas. Ribas by decision is the official pick. Next fight up, we have Peyton Talbit, a -725 favorite. The comeback on Nick Aguirre is +530. And we'll start on the Talbot side. He fought on this past season of Contender Series. He fought Reyes Cortez, and Cortez looked pretty solid early in that fight. But as we know about Talbot, he builds into his fights. Come round 2 and round 3, that's when he's at his best. He's one of those fighters that kind of, and he's even talked about this in interviews, where he likes to get his reads early on, and then once he has those reads after a few minutes, then he starts to gas pedal his opponents. He's got a ridiculous pace. He's going to keep coming forward, and he carries his power for 15 minutes. The one knock on him is that he's very hittable. So I think in order to take advantage of a guy like Talbot, you need to be able to make him pay. You need to have power when you land, and Cortez just wasn't able to do that, wasn't able to deter that pressure of Talbot. And then the other negative with Talbot is we have seen him taken down, controlled against the fence, and he gives up his back. So unless you have power, or unless you're a good aggressive grappler with cardio, I don't know if there's really any other style of fighters that will be able to beat Peyton Talbot, because I mentioned the pace is ridiculous, and a lot of these fights, he's breaking his opponents down the stretch. A lot of his finishes have come in round 2 and round 3. In fact, all of them. He does not have a first round finish, and that speaks to his style, and I think that happens here at a pretty decent clip against Nick Aguirre, who made his UFC debut against short notice on Dan Argueta, and got dominated in that fight. That was the first time he had ever been to decision. But Argueta doesn't have the striking and the power and the pace on the feet that a guy like Talbot has. So this is another one where I could see Talbot getting his reads early, and then in rounds 2 and round 3, he's able to keep the fight on the feet, keep it at space, and that's his world. And I think he'll be able to melt a guy like Nick Aguirre, and I think he gets it done in rounds 2 or round 3. We're going Talbot by TKO. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Chase Hooper, a minus 218 favorite. The comeback on the Monkey King, Jordan Levitt, is plus 180. And this is one... it really pains me to say, because you guys know I'm a big Chase Hooper fan. He's cashed multiple tickets over his last couple fights for us, which has been great. The Kolaris fight and the last fight against Nick Fiore, for whatever reason people like Fiore there. But I think this might be time to hop off the Chase Hooper train, because now he's a minus 218 favorite against a guy in Jordan Levitt who I think is going to be very competitive here. I actually think it's a pretty decent stylistic matchup for Jordan Levitt, because we know what Chase Hooper brings to the table. He's a guy that's a very slick submission grappler, will flop to his back willingly just to play guard, hunt for submissions. He can catch basically anybody, but his striking, despite looking improved in his last fight, is still not very good. His striking defense is still not very good. And in terms of his minute winning ability, it's still really not that good, because we've seen multiple times where, let's not forget, this is a guy who Alex Caceres basically dominated in that fight. Peter Barrett was up 2 rounds. Peter Barrett, one of the worst guys who was in the UFC at that time, was up 2 rounds, and Hooper had to pull off a hero submission. Not to mention, Steven Peterson controlled this dude for over half the fight, because Hooper was so willing to give up that top position and play guard, and he lost that fight against Steven Peterson. Now you're going up against a guy, and I know that was previous Hooper, 145. He seems to have a bigger frame now, and that will play at 155 pounds. He did look a lot better, a lot more physical as well. But he is still that style of fighter. So it wouldn't be the most surprising thing to me to see him give up dominant positions to a guy like Jordan Levitt, who averages over 2 takedowns per 15 minutes. He's a solid wrestler. We know he's a very solid grappler in his own right as well. He's more of a grappler. Neither of these guys are much of a threat on the feet. So I just expect it to be a competitive fight where both guys could have success in the grappling exchanges. But I'm going to take the dog in the plus 180 range, who I think probably has more of a chance to end up in dominant positions. It would not be the craziest thing to me if we saw Jordan Levitt bank 5 to 8 minutes of control time here in what could be a close fight and end up getting the decision just because he was the one who was on top for most of the fight. So this is one where I think it goes to decision at a high clip, and I think Jordan Levitt is at worst competitive in this fight, and I think plus 180 doesn't really reflect that. I really like the over at current prices. I'd be surprised to see either guy finish, but I'm going to side with the dog, Jordan Levitt. I think he's one of the better dogs on the card. We're going Levitt by decision. That's the official pick. Up next in our co-main event, we have Michael Morales, a minus 290 favorite. The comeback on Jake Matthews is plus 245. And Michael Morales is an undefeated prospect fighting out of Ecuador. He's primarily a striker. Most of his wins have come by knockout. And he's kind of been my kryptonite at the UFC and even on that Contender Series fight, because I think I tried to fade him there. I tried to fade him with Adam Fugit, which in hindsight looks really bad, even though Fugit was competitive in that fight until he got knocked out, which has been kind of the story in a lot of these. Max Griffin, last time out, competitive early, and then just kept getting stung, kept getting hurt. And that speaks to the power of a guy like Morales, who is still young, 23 years old, I believe, seems to be pretty well-rounded, comes from an Ecuadorian wrestling background, even though he doesn't really look to wrestle very often, but he definitely can hurt you if he puts hands on you. And a guy like Jake Matthews, I would be interested in if it weren't for the durability, because Matthews does have the grappling chops to maybe give a guy like Morales fits, but I don't trust him to use that game plan. And I think on the feet, that's where I'm really concerned, because Jake Matthews, despite only being knocked out once in his career, he's been hurt multiple times. And very recently against Matthew Semmelsberger, I mean, everything that Semmelsberger landed in that fight was hurting Jake Matthews. He dropped him multiple times. And I know Semmelsberger is very powerful, but guess what? So is Michael Morales. And that's what's giving me pause here, because I can see Matthews being competitive early until he probably gets dropped. And that's going to be the deciding factor for me, is the power of Morales. We're going Morales by TKO. that's the official pick. Which brings us to our main event as Brendan Allen comes in as a minus 395 favorite. The comeback on Paul Craig is plus 310. And you guys know I'm a big Brendan Allen guy. I think this dude has been underrated, not just in the market, but also just from the MMA community. Like, it seems like almost every fight people are looking to fade him. And he's done very well for himself. 10-2 in the UFC, most of those wins coming inside the distance. And his only losses came against Chris Curtis and current champ Sean Strickland. So I think he's a pretty good fighter. I think it's time we finally give him the respect he deserves. And even though he still needs to improve, particularly in the striking defense, the hands have come a long way. He can mix in the leg kicks as well. He's got solid leg kicks. But we know the ground game's his best asset. He's averaging multiple takedowns per 15 minutes, black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I think he's going to have a clear striking advantage against a guy like Paul Craig, who looked good in his debut at 185 pounds against Andre Muniz, a guy that both of these fighters have actually beaten. But we know that Muniz is historically a gas bag. He's a guy that fades after round one. That's not going to be the case for Brendan Allen. Allen has solid cardio. He's going to be landing more on the feet. He's going to be the more powerful fighter on the feet as well. And in terms of the grappling exchanges, Paul Craig is always a threat to catch somebody, and I think that's always possible with a guy like Paul Craig. But I think Allen is good enough to stay safe, especially considering I'd expect him to be the one in dominant positions where it should just be easier for him not to get caught in something. And I think that happens here. So we're going to go with Brendan Allen in the main event by TKO. I don't think this one's going even 3 rounds, let alone 5. Allen by TKO is the official pick. And as always, guys, fightnumbers.com will have my DraftKings player rankings broken down by salary tier. It'll have my ownership projections as well. It's completely free. I'll pin it in the comments. As always, thanks for watching. Best of luck, and we'll see you guys next time.